Thanks to at home for joining us this hour. There is a Russian ship called the Nikolai Chiker, which is cruising around right off the eastern coast of Florida right now as we speak. It is a Russian-flagged vessel. It was built in Finland, apparently. It's a tough little ship. It's an ocean-going tug. And for the last few days, it seems, it has been cruising around just off the east coast of Florida. And what it is doing there is not illegal, but what it is doing there is raising some eyebrows, given the status of things between Russia and the United States right now. And what it is doing there, at least what it seems to be doing there, at least to me, is kind of a surprising thing. And I think it has something to do with Ronald Reagan. One of the underappreciated things about the weirdness of the Ronald Reagan presidency is how much Ronald Reagan, as president, liked to talk about space aliens. And not like just in casual conversation. I mean, like, he brought it up at the United Nations.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Everybody in the United Nations is like, did he just say that? I'm going to wait for the translation. I think he was just talking about ooh, and that wasn't the only time he ever did that. That was the United Nations in September 1987. President Reagan also really riffed on the idea of a space alien invasion when he was speaking to a group of students in Maryland in December 1985.
I couldn't help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I don't suppose we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization. Thank you all. God bless you all.
High school kids are like, is he talking about break? Yes, it's too bad we cannot wait for the alien invasion, much as we might all long for the space invaders to actually get here. Ronald Reagan was sometimes a little weird when he openly hoped for a space invasion in multiple speeches. But sometimes when President Ronald Reagan talked about space, it was less weird. It was not only less weird, it was prescient, it was on point, and it may very well have led to that creepy Russian tug sitting off the coast of Miami right now. This was from Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address in 1984. Watch this.
We can reach for greatness again. We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain. Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade. NASA will invite other countries to participate so we can strengthen peace, build prosperity, and expand freedom for all who share our goals. Just as the oceans opened up a new world for clipper ships and Yankee traders, space holds enormous potential for commerce today. We'll soon implement a number of executive initiatives, develop proposals to ease regulatory constraints, and with NASA's help, promote private sector investment in space.
Private sector investment in space. That time, in the State of the Union, President Reagan was able to hold back from wishing that space aliens would invade the Earth. But what he was describing 30 years ago now, in that speech, it has come to pass. There is a permanently, or at least semi-permanently, manned space station orbiting the Earth right now, just as Ronald Reagan said there should be. It took more than a decade to get there, but we did get one. And it is international. Like he said, it's called the International Space Station. Now, it used to be that Russia and the United States, we would each do our own versions of space stations. If you're old enough to remember Skylab, that was the American space station that they let crash back into the atmosphere in 1979. NASA said they didn't exactly know where it was going to land, so at the time people like drew targets on stuff, and they wore T-shirts with targets on them. Somebody marketed aerosol cans in 1979 that were labeled Skylab repellent. Ultimately, Skylab crashed down in remote Australia, and there is apparently today still some sort of gray market in Skylab like bits and bobs that made it to Earth that you can traffic in the gray market. The Russians' last space station was called Mir. They let that one crash to Earth in 2001. Everybody was very worried that it was going to land on a shopping mall or something somewhere. But Mir splashed down into the ocean after providing quite a light show in the South Pacific. But now, just like Ronald Reagan said in 1984, even though the Cold War was still raging at the time, now the future that he predicted has come to pass, where there aren't individual countries anymore maintaining stations in space. There is now an international space station. And there are astronauts up there, 200 or 300 miles up there right now, all the time, working on stuff. Here's the problem, though. If where you work is the International Space Station, turns out you have a terrible, terrible commute. When we still had the space shuttle program, that was one of the ways that we could get astronauts and stuff to and from the International Space Station. The space shuttle was a truly majestic and amazing aircraft, but honestly, some of its last missions involved the necessary but sort of undignified task of just hauling dirty stuff and trash home from the International Space Station. Those vehicles could go up, they could come back, they brought people and cargo there, and they brought people and cargo back. Now, though, we don't have the space shuttle anymore. The space shuttle program was retired in 2011. And so now, how does the United States maintain our presence on this faraway, permanently manned International Space Station if we've got no vehicle to get our people and our stuff on and off of it? Turns out we depend on the Russians. We killed the space shuttle here, but they did not kill the Soyuz. And so for $71 million per seat, the Russians agree to fly American astronauts, as well as cargo, back and forth to the International Space Station. $71 million a seat. Russia's the only country in the world that maintains that capacity right now to transport stuff in and out of space. And we pay Russia to use that capacity, which only they have. Except maybe now, not for long. What happened today in Florida is something else that Ronald Reagan talked about in that State of the Union address in 1984, where he announced that he wanted to build this International Space Station program. At the end of those remarks, he said there would eventually not just be countries, but companies doing private commerce, private business in space. And today in Florida, a company called SpaceX sent up its own private launch of a vehicle called Dragon, which is delivering cargo up to the International Space Station. They're bringing up a whole bunch of stuff that the astronauts on the space station are going to use for experimenting on growing plants in space and ways to communicate between the space station and ground control back here on Earth. They also, on this trip, they're bringing this guy some legs. I'm not kidding. This is a robot that they use on the space station right now. He's called Robonaut 2, or R2 for short. Get it? R2. But one of the things that went up on the SpaceX today is a pair of legs for him. He's up there right now, and he's just like they just mounted him to a pedestal. He's just a little torso and head and arms. But once this payload that launched today out of Florida gets there, they're going to be able to stick some legs onto him. They shipped his legs. And if this promo shot is any indication, his legs are going to be sticking out at weird angles, and they're going to be a little too skinny, and it's going to be a little creepy. For now, though, at least, SpaceX and other private ventures, they can be used to ferry cargo, such as, for example, robot legs. They can be used to ferry cargo up to the space station. But these private companies can't be used to transport people to and from the space station. Not yet. They can't do that yet, but it's not going to be long. And that brings us back to the mysterious Russian tugboat off the coast of Florida today. Because the Russians they really like that they've got a monopoly on being able to transport people in and out of space. They have a global monopoly on that, and that's in part why they can charge $71 million a seat if you want to catch a ride with them. If somebody else develops that capability now, well, Russia will lose that monopoly and they will lose all that money. So NBC News space analyst Jim Oberg reports today that the Russian interest in the SpaceX program, the one that had its most recent launch today in Florida, he reports that their interest in the SpaceX program is, quote, intense. Mr. Oberg says they realize that this project threatens Russia's rocket monopoly. Once the SpaceX Dragon goes operational with crew, with people on board, there is no other Russian spaceflight service that anyone in the world will have any commercial interest in. Russia could be left behind and on the ground. And so today, as SpaceX launched its Dragon thing there off the coast of Florida, lurking in international waters, but very close by, was this ship, the Nikolai Cheeker, that Russian ocean-going tug. Turns out that tug specializes in, quote, underwater search and rescue and salvage. Oh, so just in case something went wrong with this launch that the Russians are so interested in, wouldn't mind being here to pick up the pieces and have a little look-see with whatever falls into the sea. Now, nobody is explaining what exactly that Russian ship was doing off the coast of Florida today. But what it feels like from all the evidence is that they were basically there to sort of be a peeping Tom, to be there just in case something went wrong, especially for this next phase of American spaceflight, because they really don't want this next phase of American spaceflight to work. They want American astronauts to have to trek out to Kazakhstan and get into a Russian vehicle and hand over a suitcase full of $71 million every time we want to send an American into space. It must be a particular delight to Russian President Vladimir Putin right now that in the middle of this standoff that he's having with the rest of the world and the United States and the EU, wielding sanctions against Russian officials who are very close to him, a key Russian bank that's run by one of Vladimir Putin's very close friends, with all these threats from the West against the Russian economy and the toll these sanctions have already taken on the Russian economy. It must be a delight of galactic proportions to Vladimir Putin right now that in the middle of all that going on right now globally, NASA just had to send Russia a check for $458 million. Because we're dependent on them to access the space station. And we've got astronauts up there. The U.S. just renewed a contract to send 6 more U.S. astronauts to and from the space station on a Russian vehicle at the cost of nearly $500 million. And so while we are sanctioning Russia in all of these other ways, we have also just sent them $500 million. And that makes for a very awkward headline today in the Washington Post, on the same day that the U.S. National Security Advisor is in the White House briefing room warning Russia that its economy is going to take a big hit unless they stop what they've been doing in Ukraine.
We have been very clear that we are ready, along with our partners, to impose additional costs. In the event of a dramatic escalation or significant escalation, including, as we've said repeatedly, the potential for Russia to move its own forces on the border inside of Ukraine, that those costs and sanctions could even include targeting very significant sectors of the Russian economy.
That phrase at the end there, very significant sectors of the Russian economy, that's actually just a nickname that diplomats use when what they really mean to say is oil and gas. Oil and gas is what the Russian economy is. And as undercutting and weird as it is for the U.S. government to have to hand Russia a check for $500 million for rides on its spaceships at the same time that we're sanctioning their top officials and telling them how much we're going to hurt them economically, as undercutting as that is to be happening all at the same time, consider that also today, on the same day that the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States is at the White House threatening that unless Russia backs off from Ukraine, their oil and gas sector is going to get it, right around the time that she was saying that today, do you want to know what Vladimir Putin was doing? He was at home. He was hanging out at home with the head of Shell Oil. The head of Royal Dutch Shell today went to Vladimir Putin's house. In the middle of the United States and the European Union threatening sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector, the head of Shell Oil went to Vladimir Putin's house today to promise Mr. Putin eye to eye and to promise the world that Royal Dutch Shell is, quote, committed to expansion in Russia. Quote, we are very keen to grow our position in the Russian Federation. Shell Oil today announcing plans to expand Russia's liquefied natural gas plant with the Russian state-owned company Gazprom. Within the last 2 weeks, as the United States and the European Union have levied these sanctions against Russia, as President Obama has signed an executive order giving himself the authority to, at least theoretically, lay sanctions against the Russian energy sector. Not only did we have this action from Shell today at Vladimir Putin's house, we also had ExxonMobil announced that they were starting new joint work with the Russian state-owned oil company Rosneft. They're now starting their geophysical surveys of a seafloor that they want to drill with Rosneft in the eastern Arctic. The oil company BP has more than a third of all of its oil and gas reserves in Russia. More than a third. BP's chief executive told shareholders this month that BP's investment in Russia is so large and so important that the company thinks that maybe it, as a company, can be an important bridge between Russia and the West in trying to iron out these little difficulties with the Ukraine situation. Hi, we're BP. We're here to help. As of yesterday, the President of the United States has called the tens of thousands of Russian troops amassed on the Ukrainian border a gesture of intimidation. He's insisted that they must go. Russian President Vladimir Putin says that he's received permission from his own parliament for those troops to, in fact, use force in Ukraine if Vladimir Putin wants them to. President Putin has also started calling parts of Ukraine Novorossiya, calling parts of Ukraine New Russia. And the diplomatic deal signed yesterday in Geneva, which committed pro-Russian militant groups to retreating from the government buildings they've been occupying in Ukraine, that diplomatic agreement may have been signed by Ukraine and by Russia and the United States, but the guy who says he's the head of those pro-Russian militants occupying those government buildings in Ukraine, today he said, well, he doesn't consider himself to be bound by that agreement, and his actions were kind of the most important ones that it was about. So what felt like a hope for a diplomatic breakthrough now does not necessarily feel like it is going to do much on the ground. The people who you were most looking for action as a response to that agreement say they don't feel bound by it. And with all of this going on, the supposed trump card for the rest of the world in stopping Russia from annexing more territory of a sovereign country, at least theoretically, the sword of Damocles that the West is supposed to be able to hang over Russia's head, is to cut off Russia's oil and gas sector from the rest of the world. Is that even remotely a real threat, though? Honestly, is the United States government, the governments of the European Union nations, are any institutions of governments capable of telling these giant multinational oil companies what to do? I mean, while we've been rattling this supposed economic saber at Russia, don't do it, we'll cut off your oil and gas sector, Shell Oil was literally at Putin's house today, cuddling, saying they couldn't wait to do more business with Russia. Well, who's going to tell them otherwise? And if the oil business, if these companies, these oil and gas companies, are honestly more powerful than any one country or than any group of countries trying to tell them what to do, well, then what? By Russia creating a huge national oil company and a huge national gas company, did Russia make themselves too big to fail in diplomatic terms? Joining us now is P.J. Crowley, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. Mr. Crowley, thank you very much for being with us.
Hello, Rachel.
On that diplomatic matter yesterday, that deal that was signed yesterday, and then the militants on the ground essentially saying today they don't feel like they are bound by that agreement. I see that as a very ominous statement about that agreement. Should I see it that way?
Well, it is definitely raising risk. It's one thing to come up with a reasonable package in Geneva. It's another thing to change facts on the ground. This is going to take time. I think the White House is right to say this is going to unfold over days and perhaps weeks. Everybody says that targeting Russia's energy sector, because their economy is so energy dependent, that's really the one way that the rest of the world can truly wield influence over Russia. They don't worry about international embarrassment. They don't worry about some of the international standing issues that a lot of Western countries used to think they worried about. That energy, oil and gas is really it. That's really the way that you can move them if you need to. Is that a myth? Is that a lever that's not actually available to the West? Well, I think it is a lever that's available, but not necessarily right away. Obviously, Russia does provide a great deal of energy to Ukraine, obviously, but also to Europe. So perhaps weaning Europe off of its reliance on Russian energy is something that we can do. Obviously, the United States now has an energy card that it can play as the leading energy exporter in the world. But it's going to take a decade to help with that transition. So, I mean, the dilemma is that, yes, sanctions can play a role. They tend to do that over time, not necessarily right away. Thought experiment.
let's say the United States and Germany and all the EU nations were either because of something very bad that Russia did or because of some magic wand has been waved and Europe isn't all that dependent on Russian oil and gas anymore. We were able to come to some agreement among all these different Western groups that Russia's oil and gas sector should be sanctioned, that Gazprom and Rosneft should be cut off. How would Exxon, Shell, BP, the other giant multinational oil and gas companies try to wield influence with the U.S. government about a policy matter like that?
I mean, even in the 2 or 3 rounds of sanctions that have gone on so far, you've sanctioned individuals that are from Rosneft, and it makes a complicated arrangement in terms of doing business with ExxonMobil, doing business with BP. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but obviously that's something that can become more difficult. And you know, I think for Shell, it has to think about its reputational risk of being seen in Russia in the middle of the crisis. And Shell has to be careful because obviously the president has said, I'm prepared to do more. And as you do more, the deeper that Shell gets into this partnership, it could end up losing money, leaving money on the table. So I think this is a dynamic, again, that can play over time. Right now, people are still doing business with Russia, but it has to be clear-eyed in terms of what the prospects are, and we'll see in the coming days whether Russia actually now asserts itself to try to de-escalate this. They could, and they may not.
I had a different idea about what the companies might think about their, as you described it, their reputational risk here before I saw Shell at Putin's house today. You didn't have to do it at his house if you're trying to distance yourself from what he's doing as a leader of Russia right now. I thought it was just a remarkable decision. But let me ask you about one other unrelated element, which is that this report in the Washington Post tonight that the U.S. is going to be announcing a deployment of new ground troops to Poland in response to events in Ukraine. What is the significance of that? Should we see that as an American escalation?
I don't think so. I mean, the president's been clear that he does not see a military dimension, to this. Has even been reluctant to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine, providing some non-lethal assistance. I think this is a clear and significant message, to the NATO partners in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, that we are willing to put real resources on the ground, to reassure and to protect NATO's interests. Obviously, it can send a signal to Putin that two can play this game. You want to mass troops on this border, we'll mass troops on that border. But I think it's primarily an ongoing effort to reassure NATO allies closest to Ukraine, we have your back.
P.J. Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. Thank you very much for your time tonight, P.J. It's nice to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. We've got a doozy for the interview tonight. Stay with us.